Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers. Or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Elixir Mix. This week on our panel we have Josh Adams.
Yo.
Mark Ericksen.
Hey friends.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. And this week we have a special guest, and that's Saša Juric.
Hello everyone.
Do you want to introduce yourself for those who aren't familiar with you?
Okay, so my name is Sasha, and I'm in the Elixir community. I'm mostly known for writing the book called Elixir in Action. I'm also occasionally blogging on the site called theerlangelist.com. And I'm occasionally also present at Elixir Forum, helping people out. So I've been working with Elixir for like about 5 years or so. And prior to that, I also used Erlang for about 2 years. And before that, I used other technologies like, for example, Ruby, C#, C++, and so on and so forth. But these days, I mostly work with Elixir.
Nice. Now, I think we invited you to talk about the app env and configuration.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like there are a lot of other things we could talk about as well. But why don't we start there with configuring your app and using the app env, and then we can move ahead from there.
Sure. So,
well, I think
go for it.
I think one thing that would be helpful is just kind of a little background. Like the idea of configuration has been a topic in the Elixir community, and people having, a lot of discussion around it.
Exactly.
And there's a lot of concern, and like, what's the right way? And, part of it is, I think it's a change in the way we deploy software, right? Like the idea of the 12-factor apps, and we have more Docker kind of containers that are going, like a container is built and it's going through multiple stages of deployment. And we're wanting to put a lot of configuration just through environment settings. And so I think, is there any other background you can give to this kind of topic and kind of why this is important?
Right. So let's start by clarifying how configuration is mostly done currently. I'm sure that many of the listeners will know that, but still to make sure that we're all on the same page. So like you have your Elixir project, and Elixir project is basically a bunch of source files. And then in that folder structure, you have a folder called config. And in there, you have a couple of Elixir scripts. And these are like called configuration scripts. And that is also like regular Elixir code. And what you do in those configuration scripts, you basically set key values, which are your configuration, whatever that means. We're going to try to find out what exactly configuration is today. But you basically say something like HTTP port is 4000 and database server is localhost and database name is foobar and so on and so forth. So things like that. So that's roughly how configuration works. And then you somehow start your system, and you have these keys available through some API like application.getEnv and similar functions from the application module. And you fetch those values and, you do like connect to the database, listen on the given port, and so on and so forth. So that seems like a pretty straightforward way. Now, it's worth mentioning, as I said, Elixir project is a bunch of source files. However, configuration scripts, they have like special semantics when they are actually executed, and that is happening at compile time. So during compilation, configuration files are evaluated and the values are determined. So this sometimes tends to confuse people, especially I would say the ones who came from, say, Ruby background, or I presume other similar dynamic languages where you just ship everything and ship the source code and run it on your production server. But with Elixir, Elixir is compiled language. So what we frequently do, or what I would say is the right way, is that you compile your release. So the release is like a special term in the Elixir ecosystem. It's a compiled artifact, if you will, a bunch of files, but no source files in the release. So you compile your release on the build machine, and then you put it to production. I would say this is like a canonical way. And therefore, these configuration files are evaluated on your build server rather than on your production server. And that can present a lot of problems, and people tend to get frequently confused by this thing. I would also like to mention that these configuration files are also used to vary the settings or vary the behavior between different environments. And let me clarify this a bit. So we have like 3 canonical environments when we're working with Elixir project, or Elixir project is called a mix project. Mix is the tool we use. So we have a development environment, a test environment, and prod or production environment. And these are basically more like compile targets, right? So for example, when you're running tests, you're compiling your product or project for test environment, and when you're running your classical development, you start your system, you are compiling it for development. And then, of course, when you want to release it, you're going to compile it for prod. Now, the purpose of these 3 environments is sometimes confusing people. So the purpose is to do some variations in the compiled output. So, for example, in production, I may run some periodical job, or I may fetch some feed from some external services, and maybe in development, I don't want to do that. And then in test, I might want to have some different behavior. So you're going to have some behavior variation. Maybe in development, you're going to have a debug logging level, and in production mode, you're not going to have. But one big thing which these environments are not meant for is to tie or to couple the compiled artifact to the to the execution machine. So what I'm getting at is, if I'm compiling for prod or production, I still want to run it on my development machine. Right. So this is a big deal, right? You want to test that actually the real production is working properly on your development machine. At least in some cases, you want to do that. So what this means is that, for example, the database server is not necessarily tied to the mix environment, right? Like on my machine, I always have a database locally, so the server is always going to be localhost, and that doesn't depend on the environment. So there are like these 2 different dimensions, if you will. You have like configuration of your system, which are some parameter of your system, and then you have the compile time variations, which basically are just some tweaks that determine how a version compiled for tests should behave differently than, say, a version compiled for development or production. Right. So okay, this is let's start with this. This was like a brief introduction.
That was a thorough introduction, so thank you.
Yeah, I can talk more about just, let's see where it takes us.
Okay, so we kind of have some background on, how the configuration setup is, how we encounter it as an Elixir developer, and some of the goals that we have. So what are some of the, so you'd mentioned how you feel like the right way is to do, building a release and shipping a release over instead of code. I agree. That's a great way. So like, what are some of the ways that you think someone who's new to Elixir and they're saying, I've got this app and I want to get it deployed, how should they start? Like, where would you, I don't know, what tips or tricks or any advice would you have for someone who's has their app and they're trying to go to production?
Mm-hmm. So, of course, I'm assuming that we're talking about something that's not completely a toy or an experimentational app, right?
True.
And right. So we have this thing I mentioned, release, or more precisely OTP release. And I would say that at least in 99% of the cases, this is what you want to do, right? So I'm leaving that 1% for maybe some specific scenarios where, for whatever reasons, that can't work. But I would say almost always you really want to have OTP release. And what OTP release is, as I said, it's a compiled folder structure or tarball, however you want to look at it. But there are a bunch of files and folders. You have your compiled binaries. You have all your dependencies and only those dependencies. And you have the minimal Erlang and Elixir, so minimal Erlang runtime system and minimal Erlang and Elixir standard libraries. And it's completely self-sufficient and standalone, right? So you build it, you put that same folder structure on your release machine. It has to be the same operating system and the architecture, and you're good to go, and it's standalone. So why is this good? Because first and foremost, you don't need to install a bunch of compile time dependencies on your production server. So you don't need to install Erlang and Elixir on your production server, and there will be other dependencies, maybe some libraries if you're embedding some native codes, these NIFs, how we call them, so like code written in C, for example. If you're using Phoenix, then you need Node.js. Usually you need Node.js, at least by default, on your compile or your build server, and you don't want to have that on your production. So those kind of things. So this is the first benefit. The second benefit is that you can actually easily run side-by-side different systems powered by different versions of Elixir and Erlang, because the OTP release is completely embedded and self-sufficient. So it comes with its own minimal Erlang installation. Obviously, of course, disk space, disk usage is smaller. And then, which is frequently overlooked, with the OTP release, especially when you build it with this library I'm going to mention called Distillery, you have some nice tools for hooking into your production, like getting the development shell in your production and executing a bunch of different commands in the context of your production and troubleshooting the production. And this is like super priceless. So yeah, coming back to the question, I would definitely recommend building an OTP release and deploying as an OTP release. So in theory, what you need is a build server and a production server. On a build server, you have your dependencies installed, like Elixir, Erlang, Node.js, whatever you need to actually build your project or your release. You build the release, take the tarball, copy it over to the production server, and you run it there. You just start a single command, or more likely you want to integrate it with something like systemd or upstart or whatever you're using, and that's pretty much it. Obviously, not everyone has the access to two machines, so what I do is, for example, I have my blog, which is open source, and you can actually find it, the code there, my deployment pipeline. I basically use Docker. So I set up build image, which has all these bells and whistles. I build a release, take tarball out of it, so this compiled release, and build another image, which is just built on top of the base operating system, which in my case is Alpine Linux. So I copy over that release there, and you're good to go. Right. So it's the same principle.
And you can actually do that now in a single Docker file from, which is pretty nice. That's what I'm using.
Exactly. I actually have to check. I didn't think that I'm using this. Like, you mean multi-stages building?
Yeah. So you do the builder, and you literally just copy the files into the next container, which is the actual output container.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, I actually learned I could do that by doing following the Distillery 2.0 for Docker. And I was like, wow, it's like this 2-stage thing, and it worked, and it was brilliant. And it's like I hadn't encountered that before, so that was neat.
All right, so let me just briefly mention Distillery. So I just want to mention it officially for those listeners who are new to Elixir. Like, you want to look into Distillery. It's the tool to use for deploying your systems, and it has super great guides. I really want to give compliments to Paul there. I mean, the library itself is great, but the guides are terrific, and he handles a bunch of different edge cases and special scenarios. So, like, definitely go to Distillery and do a walkthrough. There are a bunch of tutorials there.
While we're talking about actually building the release, I was going to mention just sort of one other strategy we use on another project where we actually run on a custom OS, is we have just a build server that watches GitHub releases, and we'll actually build based on the release and then push it up as the source file. So for people that are thinking, but I don't want to use Docker, there you go. There's an option.
You don't have to use Docker. Docker just makes it like cheaper to get two servers because you can get them on a single machine, right?
Right.
So are there different types of configuration that you want to put in different places, or do you generally recommend that you put them all in the same place in the same way?
So, right. So this discussion today, and it's probably based on my blog post, which is called Rethinking App Env, or Application Environment. I have like this somewhat radical opinion that this configuration is mostly bloat, and that we as the community tend to put a lot of stuff into these configuration files. So maybe I should mention some of the issues that I have with configuration, and then we can discuss the issues and the caveats and then different solutions, and then maybe we can go through some alternatives the way I see them. So, right, we have these configuration files I mentioned, and one problem is that they tend to be very bloated. They tend to contain a lot of stuff. So I mentioned in the introduction that they contain some of these compile time variations, and they also may contain some of the system or production variations, so the parameters to the system as seen by the operator of the system. That's one thing. So you can end up with a lot of key values in those configuration files. Another thing of note is that we usually use more than one configuration file. So, like, I could say that typically a gateway for everyone, or most people actually, many people starting with Elixir and working with Elixir, is Phoenix Web Framework. And many of us actually generate projects with Phoenix Project Generator. Like, personally, I even don't know how to manually add Phoenix to the system. So what Phoenix Project Generator does is it creates 5 configuration files. So like, you write mix phx.new, this is how you generate the project, very easy, and you get 5 configuration files. One is called config.exs, that's like the master file, the main file, if you will. Then we have 3 files per each mix environment, so prod, test, and dev. And then we have prod secrets.txs, which has some secrets that are not supposed to be committed to the GitHub repo. Now, in addition to this, these 5 files do not contain the whole story because there are also some parameters configured into source file, like regular source files. When you use Ecto and, of course, you use Phoenix, or you have some of the endpoint parameters, like, say, listening port is configured in the endpoint file, which is like your regular source file. And again, in Ecto, you have this function called init, where you can provide some additional parameters. So that's actually 7 places where you have the whole configuration. Now, in addition to all this, I also have the opinion that many of these parameters which reside there, or many of these values which reside there, are not configuration at all, or at least some of them. And some of them are configuration depending on the specifics of the project. So, for example, when you generate a new Phoenix project, you're going to have a module for the error view in your configuration. And it's like no configuration at all. This is like a module in your code which you're going to use, and it's not configurable at all. You're going to have, for example, Ecto database adapter specified, so like Postgres by default. And in my opinion, this is not configuration at all. This is literally a parameter to some function, because this is what it boils down to. In the end, some function is going to be called stating that you want to use Ecto, which is like a database access layer for Postgres, right? So this is not at all configuration. You don't vary it for different compile targets, and you don't vary it for production. In most cases. In all the cases I have ever witnessed, HTTP port was not configurable. I understand that it is configurable for many people, but for me, it's always the same. And I'm talking about like production projects. I always use the same port for a single application in the development, in the test, in production. So at least these are the scenarios I have had. And again, I'm not saying that it's always going to be the case, but say HTTP port is not necessarily a configuration at all, in my experience, right? So there are definitely counter cases. But either way, you end up with a bunch of these things stuffed together. So in summary, you have some compile time variations, you have some system configuration, and you have some regular parameters stuffed into these 7 files. And then you have other parameters which you just have when you're invoking functions, which are, for whatever reasons, not included in configuration. So we end up with a lot of bloat. So that's one of my personal problems, and I personally have had like issues actually analyzing and understanding these configurations because they are overlaid through these overrides, and there are a bunch of files there, and I've had problems grasping, or even properly understanding what is exactly the configuration of something. Right. So this is one issue. Let's stop here. Maybe let me hear if you have some objections or other questions.
No, you're only gonna get agreement. Because I'm going to say, I've had that problem too, where you're just trying to figure out, okay, what is the configuration that I have now? And then you're having to resort to opening an IEX terminal and then actually saying application dot get env to find out what is the settings that are present. Mm-hmm. And so that is a problem. And in your blog post, you identify also the problem of the secrets file, and how that just kind of creates that clumsy situation where it's not checked in, but the code won't compile unless it's present. So everyone has to create one. Mm-hmm. Yes, I've had to work around that with projects too, where you just say, okay, well, we're just going to do it different. We're going to say, we're going to create a sample file and that will have defaults. And so, we can certainly improve this situation. So
I also... I found myself in Ruby getting very angry when people would do class-based configuration for API clients, because it's okay, you've just decided I'm only using one of these ever. And then I found myself doing the same thing sort of based on how config worked for projects I was building. And I felt like a sham when I realized what I was doing.
Yeah. So, in general, these configurations, I've sort of tried to challenge this status quo. And some comments I've received, some people agree, of course, and some people disagree. People usually say this blanket statement that I want to have my configuration in one place. But what is this one place? We're talking about 7 files. That's not one place. So it's not really clear. And a bunch of things are stuffed in those 7 files together, and grasping what exactly is the outcome, the output of that configuration becomes harder and harder, as your project grows. Even when you start with basic Phoenix, it's not necessarily obvious what some configuration value is in some environment. Okay, so anyway, that's one issue, but it's not the only issue. There are other issues with configurations, so I'm just gonna go until you stop me.
For you, Loot Crate is offering an opportunity to save 10% on any new subscription at lootcrate.com. Just enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings. Loot Crate is one of my favorite things. Every month I get a box in the mail, costs less than $20, and it comes with all kinds of goodies. I have stuff from, just looking at my shelf, Batman, Spider-Man, Ninja Turtles, Back to the Future, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and much, much more. So if you're a geek, a gamer, anything like that, and you want cool stuff to put around your office, cool t-shirts, comic books, etc., then definitely check out Loot Crate. To save 10% on your new subscription, go to lootcrate.com/Ruby. Again, that's lootcrate.com/Ruby to save 10% on any new subscription. Enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings.
So another thing worth of noting is that configuration is like a free-form key value. So you set some keys and some values. Now, remember, like my point is, at the end, it always boils down to some function being involved with these values, right? And what you lose when you have like this plain configuration file is you lose any sort of possibility for documentation and type checking. So in Elixir is not a statically typed language, dynamically typed language, but still we have these type specifications, which are great for documenting purposes, and sometimes they can even actually work as checking whether some proper types are passed. And many libraries use these type specifications like the Elixir standard library, the Erlang standard library, and third-party libraries. However, if a library takes some parameters as through configuration, which is actually in my view done very frequently and too frequently, then the library loses this opportunity to properly type spec the parameters. So usually what you have is in the documentation somewhere, not necessarily obvious to find, you will have the list of configuration you can provide, of configuration parameters, which you provide in your config file. And then if you're lucky, this list is up to date. And also if you're lucky, you will not make a typo or you will not provide the wrong type. If you do make a mistake, maybe the thing will break early. Again, if you're lucky. If you're not lucky, the thing might not work silently. So you think it works, but it doesn't work. Maybe it works today, maybe tomorrow you update upgrade the dependency, and then it stops working silently. So a bunch of these things are broken simply because we use this free-form storage of like some sort of a side channel of these configuration key values. And as I mentioned, the documentation is in itself a problem. So if a library is taking some parameter as a regular parameter to a function, then it's in the documentation, right? You see the parameters, you see the description, you see the type specification. But if it's in config, then a library author has to place it somewhere. So for example, in Phoenix, it's not immediately obvious where you can find these configuration parameters. You have to go to the Phoenix documentation, then you have to know to go to the documentation for the endpoint module, and only then will you find the list of parameters. So it's kind of, I would say a substandard experience as soon as a library author decides to use the configuration. And similar arguments even hold for just the application itself. So like you're writing the application, it has a lot of code, a bunch of you on the team are working on it. And if you use configuration, then it's not as obvious as when you're using just functions, which you can document and type spec properly.
So I was wondering if you had a direction that you're proposing as a solution.
I am. Sure I am. Are we going to reveal it now, or are we going to still discuss some other issues?
Well, as far as background, one of the things I just wanted to mention, like as part of that whole configuration and where does it come in, like in the Distillery docs, Paul Schoenfelder, who's Bitwalker online, he created a library called Toml Elixir. I'll just put that in there in the show notes. And that is using I would say a somewhat non-standard configuration file format called Toml, Toml. And so I have actually a friend who's been using the same library as a basis, been creating one that does JSON. And just kind of giving you like a more standardized format. But it's still the idea of then you have to know that all of the config is being stored outside of the application. And so it still is a problem. So, but yeah, so I'd love to hear, what do you think is the next step then in terms of the discussion? Right. Is there something we should cover first?
let me take a step back because since you mentioned Bitwalker and this Toml Elixir, so this is the new thing introduced in Elixir, in Distillery 2.0, which are called config providers. So to explain that, I first want to explain another frequent issue, which is usually the first issue mentioned with configuration, and that is the fact that configuration is evaluated at the build server. So like you have this Elixir configuration, which is your free-form Elixir code, but runs with special semantics at the build machine. And say you want to determine the HTTP port from the system environment. So you invoke system.getEnv or whatever the function is called, and it works on your machine. And then you build the release and deploy, and it doesn't work because the environment has been determined on the build machine already. And there have been like different kind of hacks to work around that particular issue. One thing called replace OS vars and another thing called system tuple. And I don't want to go into these things because they are fairly clumsy and limited hacks. And they are pretty much historical things because now Distillery 2.0 has a much better solution for it in form of config providers, which is like a spaceship where everything else is like an abacus, or I don't know how would I describe it. So yeah, these config providers are pretty good. People are raving about it. I like them myself. So the way it works is you have like some module which has to conform to a special contract, and then Distillery is going to generate like the flow at the production, which is going to execute this code before the release itself is started. So special instance or separate instance of the Erlang virtual machine is started. And in there, you have these config providers, which can then read from the OS environment, from etcd, from Toml files, from JSON files, and so on and so forth. And the task of this code is to provide these key values. And then Distillery framework, if you will, however you want to call it, the generic code is going to store these key values into the proper file, and now you have properly configured the system. So it works wonderful. It's very easy to like even change your current config script, like Elixir config script, to split it into compile time and runtime script and have the runtime stuff, such as, for example, determining something from the OS environment running actually on the production node. It's a great solution by itself. That being said, I'm not completely happy with it because I still think it's an improvisation, and it has, again, we have special runtime semantics. So this code that is running in these config providers like Toml or JSON provider is still not running on your Elixir release node. So what this means is that, for example, if it hangs, you cannot actually connect to the node and do some tracing or live debugging. And there might be some other maybe special limitations, like if you want to say you want to connect to other Erlang nodes and then get configuration from them. As far as I understand, at least in the current form, that probably won't work, or maybe it's going to require some hackiness. And there's like some amount of ceremony in there too. So config providers are great, don't get me wrong, and they're going to solve many problems, but I still think they're overly clumsy. And the big solution, which I'm trying to propose, is basically boils down to using or deferring more to delayed decisions, to runtime decisions, meaning just taking and passing configuration as function parameters as much as possible. So, like for example, let's do a contrived example. Let's say that you're writing an HTTP server library, like a web server library, and there are two ways how you can accept the HTTP port from your client. One way is to accept it as configuration, this mechanism I have explained, and another way is to accept it as a function, right? As a function parameter. So your client invokes start server, passes HTTP port 80 and maybe some additional parameters, and it works. And the second option is much more flexible because you pretty much allow your clients full flexibility and full freedom in deciding how they will fetch these parameters, where will they fetch them from. So what this means is when I'm starting this HTTP server, I can read, say, from Vault, from etcd, from another Erlang node, from a JSON file, from a Toml file, wherever I need to read it, and I can read it using plain Elixir code, which runs in the release node in the same context where all other code is running. So this is really something that I propose, and it's not like super revolutionary. You will find the same guidelines actually included now in the official Elixir library guidelines. So they will recommend the same thing. Use, as a library author, use as much of the parameters, as much as you can of the regular function parameters, rather than mandating configuration, passing parameters through configuration.
And I think that just makes sense. It's just flexible, makes things composable. Maybe I want to run 2 of your same application on different ports in the same runtime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, another thing is one thing that I sort of have been complaining. I believe that to the extent the Phoenix generator is pushing the community and all of us in sort of a wrong direction by forcing a bunch of stuff by default into this configuration. So as I said, when you generate your project with Phoenix new or phx.new, a bunch of stuff is by default in these config scripts. And then I presume many people, and me included, like my team, we also actually historically overused the configuration because like it seems like the right way to do, but we never really thought about what actually constitutes a configuration. So what should actually go into these files? And we sometimes have these pull requests where we discuss like, should this constant go into configuration? I don't know. What is a configuration? What do you guys think? What is a configuration?
Yeah, I don't have a succinct answer, which is the first thing that sort of came to mind when I was reading your blog post the first time. Was I don't have a boundary on a bunch of the stuff that I know goes in there to say like, this totally doesn't belong there, except for, hey, things I want to tweak at runtime seem like the sorts of things that I want to be able to configure.
Right. So that would be like what I like to call system parameters, right? From the operator standpoint, So the operator might decide to maybe change the log level or maybe change the HTTP port. Maybe you want to provide it to the operator or maybe not, So, but you have to make like a conscious decision what would actually be those things.
Yeah, and also if I want to be flexible, if I wanted to hook into something like etcd and maybe actively react to a configuration change that said, hey, you should swap ports, like it's very clear that using replace OS vars isn't a solution there. Right? So that's obviously something that config in the way that I know that I would like to have it sort of falls flat.
Right. So yeah, my opinion is that config is for many people, and again, me including, like I'm going to be first to admit to make mistakes here, is that it's very arbitrary in its nature, like things just somehow end up being there because they feel like config. I literally, what motivated that blog post, one of the main thing was when one of my coworkers, when reviewing my pull request, he mentioned like, this feels like a config. And I wonder like, why does it feel like a config? And what is that kind of decision making? Shouldn't we have like some sort of rules or at least some big guidelines, like what is a config and what's not a config?
Yeah. And so like now I build things that sort of take in client configuration as a parameter. And then like, if I have an API client that I'm going to talk to basically always with the same API key, then, hey, look, I have a module that outputs that thing and pulls that from the system environment. But yeah, I mean, I don't have, aside from like knowing that that's how I run that sort of thing now, so that I have flexibility, I still don't have good guidelines, a good heuristic.
Yeah, now I'm sort of swinging in maybe another extreme where I'm starting with nothing is config until proven otherwise, So, and you start with parameters. Again, these things are at the essence of it all. These things are parameters and nothing more. There's nothing but functions and parameters in the end. And why would a parameter be promoted to some config? There have to be some explicit reasons. So one reason could be if you want to vary the settings between different compile targets. That's like config scripts are a convenient mechanism for that. And then you have another reason, which is when you want to support operator configuration. And I would say that for that scenario, config scripts are not good anyway, because you probably, like what happens is that production, these values end up in the Erlang format, and like no administrator is really going to have an easy time editing that. So you probably want to have like a TOML or a JSON or something of the sort to assist your operators and administrators. So for example, at Aircloak, we have an interesting use case. We actually ship our system to clients, right? So like if you're our client, we're going to give you 2 Docker images and you need to start the containers yourself. And you have, of course, configuration support. You basically have to mount a JSON file, well-defined JSON file, which we actually even validate the schema. And then we have actually cherry-picked these properties which make sense for you to change. So it's a fairly simple JSON format in the end. There are no hundreds of properties which you don't care about. You have like maybe 10 properties which you actually do care about, and you edit them through that mounted JSON file.
So do you have a preferred format for that? I mean, you keep bringing up JSON. Is that mainly just because it's a common, well understood format, or does it make a difference one way or the other?
Yeah, the former. It's common, like has some typing, and I'm not like a super fan of JSON for various reasons. Among others, other things you cannot have comments in there. But we decided on JSON because it's like fairly easy and ubiquitous, and I think that most of our clients and their administrators should be able to edit the JSON file.
Right. I guess the other question is, I was going to ask about environment variables, and you kind of talked around some of that. But, couldn't you set it up so that you have different apps running under different users and then use different environment variables that way, or is that too much work?
There used to be problems with providing or fetching this configuration from anything other than having them hard-coded because of these problems. So we did have these hacks which would actually support these, that would be like 12-factor applications, right? What you're talking about.
Yeah.
Precisely. So we had this replace OS vars and this system tuple, and the common theme was that was some hack which would allow you actually to set environment variables and then fetch settings from there. We, for example, in our case, we mostly don't do that. In the previous incarnation of our system, we actually relied more on environment variables. I think that one problem I have with envs are that they are basically strings. So you don't really have like any sort of good typing. So JSON is a little bit better in that respect. And then, of course, if you want to have some hierarchical formats, that also can become messy. You pretty much have to just unwrap it and have like a bunch of prefixed env variables instead of maybe a nicer JSON hierarchy.
Yeah, I use replace OS vars extensively, and I'm somewhat eager to stop.
I think with the Distillery 2.0, it really there's really no even need to use that. Yeah.
So you said that there are some things you don't like about JSON. So, I mean, is there a format you like, or do you just have a wish list of a format that doesn't exist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not really sure. So in my view, I would actually like if I was able to run everything in Elixir directly. And the thing is that Elixir has this support. So it's many people will say the same holds for Erlang. I mean, everything is rooted in Erlang. It's like the operating system for your code. So you can, in fact, just start your system and pass a bunch of these parameters to this so-called supervision tree, and you organize your services like that through your code. And then you expose only the bare minimum which you want to expose for your operators. And that will be like then fairly simple files. I don't know, maybe TOML would work better, or maybe JSON. I'm not really sure about that. I don't know. What do you think? Is there something better which would be something like strong type and support comments?
Not that I'm aware of.
Like I've been doing Kubernetes, and YAML is the format that is used most often there. I do like that I can have comments. I will say that.
Yeah.
I feel like YAML is an example of a pretty low bar, like local maximum. I hate it every time I'm in it.
But at the same time, it is so easy to accidentally create invalid JSON. Like you left a comma on or something.
I will say the idea, JSON's terrible. I'm not saying YAML's worse than JSON. Don't get me wrong. JSON's just actually very bad. But you can use it, and everyone does, so you do.
Yeah.
That's the JavaScript way.
I would say between YAML and JSON, I would probably pick JSON, but it's a really hard choice. It's like choosing lesser of two evils.
Yeah, I would pick YAML, but I wouldn't pick either. I like the idea of just outputting like a struct that is like a defined type, that is the configuration for my application. And, however you get to that, whether you have a provider that, I don't do this yet at all, of course, because that would be work. But that seems like where I would want to be. And then you can have a provider that reads in the TOML and merges it into the struct. And then you just have stuff that uses that configuration value.
But I think like the key is always to really clean up, to purge this configuration in the first place. Like my impression is that there are a bunch of things there. When we're talking about particular system, not like a generic component, like say Nginx, Nginx has to be highly configurable because it's going to be used in different scenarios. But when we're talking about our system, probably a bunch of stuff which are in theory configurable, really no one cares about that.
Yeah, so like recently I've had a library I wrote. It was just an internal to the project, but there was configuration, but that configuration really, it does not belong on being, it's configured for the project. I'm not sure what you call that, but it's not like an environment setting. It's like when I bring in this library, I want to use it, and this is how I'm going to use it for this project. I'm not setting it anywhere outside of the project. So where should those kinds of settings be? I mean, obviously they're just parameters, but like where would you like to see something like that so that we can pull those things out of our config files and keep our config files a little more pure in that way?
This is a great question. So in my view, these things should be grouped by scope. So what this means is, let's take Ecto, for example, or Phoenix application when you generate it. So by default in config, you configure a repo, which is like your database, and the endpoint, which is your server. And those things are configured in the same 5 files, plus 2. So I think that it would be actually better if we configured the endpoint in the, say, endpoint module, or maybe in some other module, but let's say endpoint module. So what does configuring endpoint mean? Like, are you going to use HTTP and/or HTTPS? Which port are you going to use? You may have some of this base key, like secret thing. So things like that. These things belong to the endpoint, and they're then logically grouped together. Likewise, when you're configuring Ecto, or your database, then the database name, server, and user should be configured in the database module, like the repo module, for example. I believe that this actually improves discoverability, because like if I want to find out how my database settings or parameters are retrieved, where from, the first place I'm going to look to is the database module, right? That makes sense. You start from there and then you work your way through functions if you don't find it there. And you start from there and you see it there. Just clean, unobstructed by all this other noise from all the other pieces of your system. And I mean, of course, the fact that the parameters are passed there doesn't mean that they are defined there. So you could open up the repo module and see that, I don't know, the database name is fetched from the operating system environment, and the user password is fetched from some secret file or something like that.
And you could even end up hoisting those inputs to your config, and that's your exposed config. Conceivably, right? But it shouldn't be kind of hard-coded expected.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, it's not going to be hard-coded probably. You don't want to hard-code at least the username and the password. And I mean, the server is usually going to be different in production than on your machine, right?
Yeah, sorry, I meant the config shouldn't be just always hoisted up in total, up into the actual operator-facing config, for instance.
Yeah.
Like in production, maybe they shouldn't be able to turn off HTTPS.
Exactly, precisely. And this ties to the fact that you always have to, I think, consciously ask, is this actually a configurable parameter or not? Do you want to make this configurable parameter at all?
One thing that you mentioned is you keep talking about secrets. And I got sidetracked for a minute and I may have missed it, but did you talk about how you encrypt or otherwise protect secrets if you're putting them into some kind of config file, like a JSON file?
Yeah, so that's sort of out of the scope of how you determine configuration. There are these secrets which are by default just Phoenix will just propose that you have this prod secrets EXS file where you just define these secrets, and it's up to you how are you going to protect them, So, but you probably want to use some encryption scheme, or maybe, I don't know, Vault or whatever else for that.
Yeah, I push them up to Kubernetes secrets and then mount them as environment variables, as an example, and then use good old replace OS forms.
Right. So
that's what I was wondering. Right, is that and Rails has a secrets file too, but ultimately, if you encrypt them, then you have to provide the key to the app in order to encrypt them, and then your key is a secret. And so it feels like this circular problem.
Down the rabbit hole, yeah, that's true. I mean, ultimately, you have to fetch it from somewhere. So our clients provide a secret in the JSON file, and it's their responsibility to actually restrict the access to the JSON file itself. Previously, tying to what Josh said, so our current system is like the second incarnation. We actually had a previous incarnation which was significantly different, and then we used etcd as our configuration provider. Back then it was Erlang, so we of course didn't have all the new fancy stuff available in Elixir now, like Distillery 2.0. So what I did is I would use replace OS vars kind of thing just to fetch the etcd location, and then during the application startup, so you have like this entry point, I would fetch parameters or the secrets from the etcd. This, however, there will be some edge cases when this don't work, usually when a library overuses a configuration scheme. So when it actually fetches the parameters during the library startup, which happens before our own client startup, application startup is executed.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the sort of thing that kind of drives home the point of, hey, config is unwieldy when you're dealing with that sort of thing. And I've dealt with that as well, where libraries sort of absolutely assume they're going to be configured a certain way, and it reduces flexibility.
Precisely. This used to be especially the case. So first of all, this is not an Elixir thing. I've seen this thing happening in Erlang libraries too. For one example, I can immediately think of was React Ensemble, which is maybe not so famous library, but it's an interesting library that I don't know if it even still it is maintained, but at the time it gave us like strongly consistent key value, distributed key value, and it required mandatory configuration upfront, so I was not able to tweak it with any of the traditional hacks I normally did. And this really made it hard for me to test the thing locally. Like I wanted to start a couple of local nodes from the same project that didn't work out of the box, so I actually forked the project and had to modify the project. And I mean, it's like a pretty terrible user experience. And in general, my impression is that Elixir libraries in the, like, say, early days or maybe up to a year ago, they used to really overuse the configuration thing. So you would configure, I remember there was like, for example, Guardian, the authentication library. The early version required like a global setting. You configure Guardian with some parameters, and you can only therefore have uniform authentication configuration in your system. We actually had problems with that too at some point. Now the new Guardian, I think, works in a better way. So one important thing that, or two important things that happened. So first, there was a blog post by Michal Muskala, so from the Elixir core team. He blogged about configuration in Elixir. And then a bit later, I think that parts of this post and some other recommendations have been included in the official Elixir documentation for the library authors. And in there, you will also find a lot of advices like don't use configuration unless you really need to. Because when a library mandates configuration, then it really limits the flexibility of the user. Even with all these fixes and workarounds we have, ultimately when a library mandates configuration, that's going to somehow end up as being a singleton thing. So the library sort of constrains the user into running at most one thing, really preventing like things like dynamically starting multiple instances and things like that. And it just makes it, in general, much clumsier for the user code to provide the parameters.
Do you have any stories of people getting this wrong and fixing it or having pain because of it, or people just getting it right? And I guess people don't talk about that because it just kind of goes to go, and they don't complain about it because it just is smooth. I don't know. Do you have any good stories, I guess is what I'm asking?
Well, I mean, there are many stories. So, like we started with Elixir fairly early in our system, and then, as I said, many early libraries actually got it wrong. It's not a big deal, you know. It's just they used some other pre-existing libraries as a template, and they just went that way. And somehow this story about overusing configuration, I think, is an old story even from the Erlang days. That's my impression. And so then we, at our project, you know, we would face these problems, and we had to do all sorts of shenanigans. So, for example, I would provide a fake configuration because I had to in the config file, and then in the application start code, I would actually rewrite it at runtime. I think we even have such code running, still running, so I don't think we have changed it. Sometimes we basically had to just accept the reality and maybe deal with that we cannot have variations, because when a library mandates configuration, as I said, it's a singleton, so then you cannot have two different settings in two different execution contexts. Like in one place, you cannot have one setting, and in another place, a different setting. So we sort of just decided to live with it. But these were the things of the past. One thing that I would mention, and I think this would be the credit for Paul Schoenfelder or Bitwalker. In his exploration, so he's really doing some intensive work on these OTP releases, and he really identified that so people coming to Elixir are frequently saying that the deployment is confusing. And one of the big causes for this is quite likely this configuration or over-reliance on configuration, and all sorts of problems that I've mentioned that come with this configuration with different execution contexts and so on. And So Paul really nicely identified that. And I think, again, that really good way for most libraries would be to accept just parameters and let the users deal with how are they actually going to fetch these parameters from whichever source they want to fetch it.
Guess one more question I have is around the idea. I think one of the reasons we put things in the application config files is because we know it happens very early on in the setup process. And being that Elixir is a more functional language, it's kind of the question is, well, how do I put in some config for, that's optional maybe to the project? How do I put in some config that will be available at runtime, and it needs to be available very early, right? It's like, I think that's one of the reasons we just kind of stick things up there, because it gets put into application env just by putting it in there. So
I think ultimately you're either going to be running a supervisor, in which case, hey, there's where you configure it, or you're going to be using a library, in which case it can take configuration as an argument. And so then it doesn't matter.
If it is a library and you pass it configuration, like where does it put it? To hold on to it. It
shouldn't. My argument would be, if it's a library and not an application, then it shouldn't. It doesn't have any state. If it's an application, I think it probably still shouldn't store it in most cases. But
a library can have a state, of course. Like when you start a Phoenix instance or a Phoenix server, there is a port, and Phoenix should know which port is it, for example, and maybe some other parameters which are related to your web server. Or maybe even a better example is Ecto repo. So you start a repo, and there are parameters to that repo. These are the connection parameters. And what's going to happen is some connections are going to be started over time. So Ecto has to keep this state. But it doesn't have to keep it in an application environment. Application environment is a global, shared, mutable state. Why would it have to keep it there? It can just keep it on the stack, in some parameters, and it's just going to invoke other functions passing those parameters.
So that's exactly what I'm talking about. And so I'm thinking just from a practical aspect, like, so where do I put it? Do I put it like in a gen agent, like an agent, like a gen server kind of thing, and like just kind of hold on to that config that way? I'm just kind of curious as to where you would recommend that it goes.
So sooner or later, there is some gen server or something like that, which is actually going to respond to user requests, right? And then you're going to put it into the state of that gen server, for example.
Okay.
Whenever a request arrives, like start me new instance, the gen server has the state internally, right, in its own state, and it just knows the connection parameters and starts. Now, it's worth mentioning that there are some libraries that have to be configured before our application starts. So again, our application start callback is not the first thing running in our system. We have dependencies. These dependencies are started before our application is started, and they may need some configuration before that. The only legitimate case I can think of where actually a dependency or a third-party library needs some setting before we start is Logger, right? So
that's actually what I was configuring. I was configuring Logger. Customized logging, like putting out in JSON formats and being able to blacklist different metadata keys, because I want all of them by default, but I don't want these. I don't want PID. I don't want the line number, that kind of stuff.
So with Logger is difficult because, there are other applications that might be using Logger during their startup. So a bunch of stuff could be logged before the first line of your actual code is being executed. And so you want to provide some configuration for Logger upfront. And this is, in my opinion, a great case for config or application environment. I can't really think of any other case which I would justify. There probably are. I just cannot think of any. And I would like to tie again to Paul's great guides for Distillery. So he discusses some of these things in the new Distillery guides, and he mentions these, how he calls, a la carte OTP applications. And this is a great section. So this is how I feel that most of the libraries should be designed. And if you're not sure how to design a library, you should design it in the a la carte way. And what a la carte really means is a factory, if you will. So let's take an example. It's going to be easier to think about. Let's say you use Cowboy web server. So not like the full Phoenix web framework, but this lower level library. And Cowboy is really a factory of web servers. So you can basically, you request a child specification and you inject the Cowboy server into your supervision tree, and you can start multiple web servers from your code, and this code runs in your supervision tree. And what this means is that you're in the full control of how your system is starting up or shutting down for that matter too, right? So basically almost nothing runs in the Cowboy supervision tree, and therefore when the system is started, Cowboy startup code doesn't really do almost anything, maybe just sets up some global process or whatever. The Ecto does something similar, and then everything else is started on demand by the user code or by the application code, and it's controlled by you. And if you're designing an a la carte, how Paul calls it, a la carte OTP application, then you're giving really a full freedom to your user to first and foremost start multiple instances. So you don't constrain yourself to like some singleton or global instance, and you also allow your user to actually run whatever code they want before they actually want to start the thing. And this is, in my view, the best way to design libraries, other than maybe Logger, because I really cannot see the case for running multiple loggers, and they would still have to be started before the application, before the other applications are started.
No, that makes sense.
All right, well, let's go ahead and do picks. Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Josh, do you want to start us with picks?
Yes, I do. So I'm going to pick one thing. It's called Elm Beam on HKGumbs/Elm Beam on GitHub. And it generates Beam code from Elm code. And he's also written separately a thing called Codec Beam that is just a facility for generating Beam code in Haskell. So normally when you're generating Beam code, you're going through Erlang, but this generates it directly from Haskell. So it's really neat. It's an opportunity for more people to build languages that compile to the Beam. And so I want people to know about it. And that's it.
Awesome. That sounds really cool. I actually was chatting with Richard Feldman last week about Elm. And lots of interesting stuff going on there for sure. Mark, what are your picks?
So I just had one this week, and that is a project that I use. It's called Etcher.io. And what it is it's an Electron-based application for burning ISO images to USB. And you think, man, Electron, that is big overkill, right? And maybe it is, but I love it because it looks nice. So like a little background, I'm a Linux user. I prefer Linux over Windows and Mac. And so I use it for my desktop and laptop and everything. And so frequently I will be trying out a new distro or something like that. And so you download an ISO and you burn it to like a thumb drive or something. And Etcher is a nice one just because it won't let you accidentally select your primary hard drive, right? It will only let you select a removable drive. And it just does really nice because it gives progress and does the CRC checks and everything. So it's a fun one. If you're ever playing with ISO images, just pick Etcher.io.
Nice. I'll go ahead and jump in with some picks. So the first one that I have, I was doing, I think it was my Angular story. No, it wasn't. It was my JavaScript story interview yesterday. And the person I was talking to, he was, I showed up a little bit late and he's like, oh, it's fine. I was just playing with tweet mashups. So I think it's tweetmashup.com. Yeah, tweetmashup.com. So what you can do is you can put in your Twitter username or anyone else's for that matter. And then Sasha, what's your Twitter username?
It's SasaJuric. So basically my name, last name without any special characters.
Awesome. So you put in these usernames or the Twitter handles on tweetmashup.com.
Okay.
And then it put stuff together. So the combination I got was good morning, #lambdup.
Okay.
Elixir in Action, second edition is 40% off today. To get it, use the code, and then it has code in it. The discount is also valid for other Manning books. Happy to send along proposals for future advertising. So it mashed in something that I put in about future advertising and sometime in the past with your tweet about Elixir in Action.
Okay, cool.
Anyway, you get some funky stuff. Some of them are really kind of funny and clever. I think the one that I did with that guest, it was basically like the future something. It was really short, but it was really kind of funny and weird at the same time. So anyway, I've kind of been playing with this. I wonder if I can just run this again. Here we go. So this one's better. So this one's a mashup between Sasha and I again. It says, I just got a call from my wife, the director at some point. And then it has the ASCII smiley. And then you can hit the tweet this button. So anyway, tweet mashup is kind of fun. The other pick that I'm going to throw out here is the Shush app. Now, I tend to not use it, mainly because I just know the key combination to mute and unmute Zoom while we're talking. But it is kind of a nice app when we're recording, and a few people had it installed during Ruby Rogues. And so I'm going to shout out about that. It's basically push to talk or push to mute. You can configure it either way. And what it does is if you're in a noisy environment or something like that and you're trying to record a show, then you can make it so that you have to press a key in order for your mic to be enabled. And so then when you take your hand off of the key or off the keyboard, then it goes back to mute so that you're not putting noise out there inadvertently. So anyway, kind of a nice app. And it's something that we recommend to our guests as they're preparing. So anyway, Sasha, what are your picks?
Okay, so I have two picks related to the topics we discussed. So one are the library guidelines in the Elixir official documentation. And another one is the section called Runtime Configuration in Distillery documentation. So these are really two great resources, which I would advise for the library authors and then for anyone who actually wants to deploy something. And then I have three of shameless self-plug links. So one is the link to Elixir in Action 2nd edition, which is due to come out soon. Not really sure when. It's up to Manning now, but the content is free. We are very late in the production, so it's going to come out pretty soon, I think within a month or so, I hope. My own blog, The Erlangelist, at theerlangelist.com. And then one talk, which I did on multiple occasions last year, it's called Solid Ground. And for anyone who actually is interested into learning what Beam is all about, the Erlang virtual machine, and why are these Beam languages like Erlang and Elixir very compelling, this is the talk where I try to capture the essence of it. So yeah, those will be my picks.
Awesome. And I usually ask where people can find you online, but you called all that out. So
exactly. I'm on Twitter, and otherwise, whoever has some questions, I recommend elixirforum.com. So let's add that one to the link too, because there are many people online there. So I'm there. You have like Jose, the creator of Elixir. You have Joe and Robert, the creators of Erlang. Chris, the creator of Phoenix, is there. The Elixir core team, and a bunch of other great people. Very helpful. So like whatever questions about Elixir you have, elixirforum.com would be the place I recommend.
Nice.
I wanted to give one more shout out to his book. When I was first coming to Elixir, I started with Dave Thomas's Ruby book or Elixir book, and I was having a hard time kind of getting Elixir. And I found Elixir in Action from Saša Juric, and it was the first edition book, and that really clicked with me. And I just think, it's nothing against Dave Thomas's book. I just think some books are better adapted or written for different people. So if you come to one book and that's not speaking to you, feel free to try another one. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Sasha's book, that it was really the book that helped me kind of get Elixir and to really get into it and enjoy it. So I'm looking forward to the updated version.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to hear that.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Encourage people to go check out the book, and we will catch you all next week. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.